workshop sold out. I was encouraged by Aaron May and some other people. They're saying, "Hey, we don't have enough chromatic stuff. There are a lot more people out there playing chromatic dulcimer." And I thought, well, okay, I'll go ahead and I'll do one. And so it's wonderful to see how many people are signing up for this. You wouldn't have found this about 5 years ago. People are like, chromatic dulcimer, man, that's the devil. You know, but more people are interested, and it's you know, people have their way of looking at it. It's just a 3-string guitar or whatever. But we're only 3 notes away from being fully chromatic with a 1.5 fret. So we're already there. We're already adding frets. And I love the fact that the chromatic can coexist peacefully with purely diatonic dulcimers and those with a couple of extra frets and that kind of thing. So it's an unusual instrument that exists that way in many different permutations. And I do believe that's it. So let's go ahead and jump in. I gave you a good amount of materials here, and these materials are from my book, Method for Chromatic Dulcimer, through Fullcraft Instruments, the Fingers of Steel series. I know many of you out there have got this. This is an opportunity for me to illustrate it a bit. And a lot of this is mainly for resource. And I just got finished teaching a traditional mountain dulcimer tuning CGG workshop. And one of the things that came up was with, if you're used to dealing in 1-5-8 tuning, DAD, CGC, that kind of thing, as soon as you get into a different tuning configuration, you get different numbers on tablature. So even though you might be able to eyeball this stuff and get an idea of what everything is, it can be very difficult to jump right in and start playing tablature for a new tuning that you're not really familiar with, or a new configuration of stuff. So even though there are a lot of pieces of music in this, we're not really going to play through them because of the first thing I'm going to discuss here. So take out your handouts, and I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and I'll do a quick review and an overview of everything that I've got here and what we'll be looking at. So I'm going to connect with the iPad, click share. I'm going to drag down from the top right corner, hit screen mirroring, and then bring that up on the screen. And then I'm going to embiggen it and take a look at the first page we've got here. So at the very, very top, we've got the fret numbers for diatonic conversion. That is, if you are going to be trying to play your diatonic tablature on the chromatic dulcimer, these are the additional half steps and numbering conventions that you're going to need. And then right below that are the chromatic fret numbers, and these are the standard that are used by guitarists, mandolin players, banjo players, and that type of thing. So here's my honest approach to this and my point of view on this thing. If you're getting into the chromatic dulcimer, you're probably a more experienced player, and you are probably understanding a bit about building chords and harmony and understanding, and maybe playing a lot by ear and figuring things out and not just looking at tablature. If you've made that leap to go to chromatic dulcimer, I have discovered that it is just simpler to use those chromatic fret numbers and not try and put the half after everything. The reason being is that you're going to have a lot of chords that are going to look similar, and they're going to have similar numbers in them. You'll have one chord that's got a 1, and then one chord that's got a 1.5, and a chord that has a 4 and a 4.5. And, you know, you can make it as large print as you want to. It's still a lot of stuff you got to squint at. But even with that, I do not play from tablature on the chromatic dulcimer. I think really, truly the best way to go about it is simply to learn the notes, know how to chord build, and then play from there. That is really the easiest way to go about doing this. Tab is a great fallback if you want to write this stuff down and not work with standard music notation. But in the end run, it really is more important at this point just simply to learn the notes, and we'll talk about that, understand a bit about chord building. And here's the magical thing that makes it really awesome. We are in DAD tuning for this. You can use the exact same chord shapes that you do when you're tuned in with a diatonic dulcimer. You're going to allow for more half steps, more fret spaces, obviously, between where you would normally go. But it's not that far off the mark. And once you learn what those differences are, you could pretty much get up and running right away. The other thing is that once you learn those three chords, all you really need to do at that point is learn what notes to alter, which notes to shift one direction or the other to get these other chords, color chords, extended chords, and other things. And I think it's a lot easier than trying to stare at a bunch of numbers, especially even with the chromatic fret numbers. I mean, they go up to 12 just in the first octave. And if you're like me, you start looking at double digits, you're like, oh, really? Because they start to blend in together after a while. So what I've got here on that first page is kind of a practice fretboard for you to draw out chord shapes and that type of thing. So make sure that you print out a number of those copies and work through them. All right. Then we move over here to our chromatic scale. The chromatic scale, it can start at any point. At this point right now, you're looking at it, it starts at D because we're in DAD tuning, so it helps to start from the root of the key that we're kind of hanging out in when we're not fretting any strings. But you can start it from D sharp, you can start it from G, you can start it from C, C sharp. It's chromatic, it's all half steps. They're all a half step apart. And no matter where you start playing it from, even though you're going to be playing a different note, if you play all the notes in a row, unlike the mountain dulcimer, you're always going to get the same thing. It's all going to be the same. So it's up to us at that point is to figure out what our starting point is. And then once we figure out our starting point, our root, our first, then we start measuring from there, up a half step, up a whole step, up 1.5 steps, all the way through till we get to the octave, and learn those intervals. This is the foundation of understanding the chromatic dulcimer, is knowing your intervals, knowing the distance between that note and what that interval sounds like and what that interval is called. That starts to point the way towards chord building, because inside of every chord are a couple of different intervals. And then when we go beyond that, then you start getting into functional harmony and how those chords, as they move from one chord to another, how those notes inside the chord can go from interval to interval in different chords and what that creates. So we're building a house that truly starts with the intervals. And so I like, in fact, my patrons on Patreon right now, we're doing a special learning track of interval ear training. And I've got beginners in there and I've got advanced players in there. And the one thing they have in common is many of them haven't looked at the intervals at all. So I think it's a really good starting point. And so I'm going to illustrate this chromatic scale that you see by playing the notes on the dulcimer and starting to put some earworms into your head. I'm also going to put out a recommendation for a great ear training app that I've been using for about 7 or 8 years now, and I'm going to give that to you right now. It's also going to be in the video that'll be made available to you. The name of the app is called Better Ears. Better Ears. So if you simply put Better Ears into the search engine, you'll come up with a couple of things. You will come up with a desktop application that you can run from your computer, and you'll also come up with an app that you can use on your mobile devices. Both are excellent. It's really handy to have this on an app. I always tell people, I'm telling my students right now, when you go to the bathroom, don't take a book, take the app and drill those intervals. Drill them, drill them, drill them, learn them well. It's going to be boring as heck, but when you know them, it's going to open up a part of your life, and everything else after that is going to be so much easier, hearing those relationships between the notes. So Better Ears is the name of the app, and I highly recommend it. And here's the reason. There's a lot of interval ear training out there on the web. The thing is that a lot of them are in the shape of games and so forth, and they're kind of fun, and they do kind of teach you what everything sounds like, but there's no feedback on how you're doing. The thing about Better Ears is that it keeps track of your progress, and you can reset the score, but once you go out of training or learning mode and you go into training mode, it starts quizzing you. It plays this, and you go, that's minor second. It'll go, wrong. That is a perfect fourth. It gives you the answer, but it also marks you wrong, and then it keeps track of that. What you can end up doing is then you can go to the scoring section of that, whether it be intervals, chord training, pitch training, rhythm training, time signature training. It covers all of these, not just interval ear training. But you go to the interval ear section, and it'll show all the intervals that you have been quizzed on, and it'll have a green line for how good you're doing and a red line for how good you're not doing. And you can look at it and eyeball immediately, ooh, I need to work on my minor sixths. So let me go back to the drawing board and listen to nothing but minor six intervals in different keys for a while, and then go back. Having that virtual coach there is absolutely worth its weight in gold, as opposed to just willy-nilly running pairs of intervals and not having anybody tell you if you're doing okay or not. It keeps track for you, and if you're really embarrassed by how you started, you can erase them and start over again. So it's a good thing to have. Better Ears, fabulous. Okay, so here is our chromatic scale starting from D. D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and D. I'm going to end this up right there at the 12th fret, and then back to open. All 12 notes of the chromatic scale. Let's listen to each one and see what they sound like. Now, one thing I want you to notice that we've got a couple different types of intervals that show up a lot. You're going to see minors, you'll see majors. And in a second, that's going to make a lot of sense if you haven't studied this a whole bunch. So where we start from is always the first, it's always the root. And then the relationship between that root and a half step up is the minor second. That's always going to sound like the Jaws theme. That's a minor second interval. But if I don't play the first fret, if I go right from the open and then go to the second fret, I'm skipping that first half step. So I've actually traveled a whole step, because two half steps make a whole step. So if I go to the second fret from the open, now I'm playing a major second interval as opposed to a minor second interval. And that happens to be the second note of the D major scale. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to switch to the Dulcimer fretboard. Okay, so we went from open to the first fret here. That's the minor second interval. Anywhere on the fretboard you start and just go up one fret, you're going to get a minor second interval. Same thing with all these intervals. No matter where you are at on the fretboard, if you go these certain amount of frets up, you're going to get this interval. So there's your minor second. Going to skip that fret, go directly here. Two half steps make a whole step. That should look familiar. That right there, that's a whole step. That's a wide space on our diatonic mountain dulcimer. Going right here is going to give us a whole step. That's going to give us a major second interval. Second note of the major scale. Going from the root to the third fret is going to give us the minor third interval. Lullaby, lullaby. There's all kinds of these little musical phonetics you can use, or earworms, to remember what they are. if you're a Nightmare Before Christmas fan, I always like to use what's this, what's this for your minor third interval. Going up one more half step from the root is going to give us our major third. Do a dear, do a dear. Over the years, I've picked up a lot of different tricks that people use, audio tricks, and notes they associate them with. Mine are just merely suggestions. I have a few of the book. You'll probably come up with your own when you recognize them. In fact, when you start really drilling these intervals, you're going to start hearing intervals everywhere and naming them. It's really quite fun once it gets to that point. Major third interval right there, going from open to the 4th fret. Now this is an important interval because it's something that we're going to be listening for a lot when we're playing in jams and stuff. It's the perfect fourth. The perfect fourth, it sounds like this from the root. And that's G we're going to right there. This one's really, really easy to remember. Here comes the bride. Here comes the bride. That's a perfect fourth interval. So we've had this pattern of minor than major, then minor than major, and now we got this perfect thing going on. And if you look across that chromatic scale, you see that there are only 2 of these perfect things going on, the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth. Why aren't they minor fourth and minor fifth and major fourth and major fifth? It's because of the frequency that these pitches are at. And if you start from the root and you get to the perfect fourth, you have actually doubled your frequency, so it's perfect where it is on the sound frequency spectrum. When you get to the fifth, the same thing happens. You've got like a perfect number that happens. It's the difference between A440 and A880, an octave above. They're perfect the way they are. So listening for the perfect fourth is super important because it represents the fourth when we're playing music with other people, and being able to recognize that 4 chord is super important. This next interval is a bit of a problem, this G sharp here coming from D. This is the interval that was forbidden by the church, Catholic Church in the 10th and 11th century. It was called the devil's interval. It sounds like this. It does have a sort of demonic sound, doesn't it? Or it sounds like one of those sirens, you know, in Europe. But it could also be quite beautiful. Maria, Maria. So it can be beautiful as well as slightly disturbing. That is the tritone interval. And the tritone lives in between our only 2 perfect intervals, the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth. Sandwiched right in between them is the tritone. Man, if that ain't a trick of math, I don't know what is. That is the tritone. Let me show you the perfect fifth, and then I'm going to show you a couple of things that you should be aware of when dealing with this area of the chromatic scale. The perfect fifth is next. Going from D to A, if we start with D as the root, A, B, C, D. Or the Flying Monkeys from The Wizard of Oz. Yo, yo, yo. That is the perfect fifth. So there's the perfect fourth. Here comes the bride. And there's the perfect fifth. Ba, ba, black sheep. And smack dab in the middle is the tritone. So I mentioned, why don't we have minor and major for the fourth and fifth? It's because they're perfect. Can we alter these intervals? Absolutely. So if I wanted to take the fourth and I wanted to actually make it altered, take it up a half step, I would be augmenting it. And so the tritone would also be called an augmented fourth. That is an augmented fourth, and that's an inharmonic spelling. Inharmonic means we spell them differently, but we're talking about the exact same pitch. So that is an augmented fourth. Now, that tritone is also something else. If we take the perfect fifth down a half step, we flatten it down a half step, we diminish. So if we take these chords or these notes and move them upwards, it's augmented. Take them down a half step, we are diminishing them. So the tritone can also be seen as a diminished fifth. So the tritone has three names: tritone, and the space between, well, there's a tritone, there's a tritone interval, there's a tritone chord. The tritone really refers more to the chord and the number of half steps. But it's also a augmented fourth. It's also a diminished fifth. And they all live in that tight little space right there at the 6th and 7th frets. 5, 6, 7, yeah. Okay, now we get back to our pattern of minors and majors. So right after the fifth, perfect fifth, we end up with our minor sixth interval. And there are a lot of musical mnemonics for this, but if I play it backwards, I hear the theme from Love Story. Bum, 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 ba, dum, da, da, dee, dee, da, 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 so forth and so on. Nino Rota, one of the great scores of all time. So it's a minor six interval from the D going up. And that's A sharp, same thing as B flat. In harmonic spelling, same pitch we're talking about, depending on the scale you're in, or if you're heading upwards, or if you're going down, usually. Which is funny, because if you're tuning, typically your tuner will tell you A sharp, it will not tell you B flat, for whatever reason. From the root to up here is our major sixth interval. N, B, C, N, B, C. That is the major sixth interval from the root coming up to the 9th fret. And we're down to our last ones. Further away we get from the root, the more you sort of have to listen, because we've got a lot of space. It's so much easier to tell what these guys are when they're hanging out real close to each other. When they start getting further apart, you really kind of have to listen for the relationship. This is a minor seventh interval. That's the first two notes of the Star Trek theme, man. This one gave me a lot of headache. This one and the next one when I first started training. Again, because they're just so far away from the root. That is a minor seventh interval. Next up is the major seventh interval. And I mean, only thing I usually think of is this is in every single John Barry soundtrack ever written. Dances with Wolves, The Black Hole Out of Africa. He loved him some major seventh intervals for melody. Beautiful stuff. You can also think about that as being, if I go up one more half step, I'm at the octave. You're so high up on the chromatic scale, you can start seeing the major seventh, the minor seventh, maybe the major sixth as being down from the octave as opposed to up from the root. And these intervals all sound a bit different when they are ascending and descending. Major intervals will sound major when they're ascending, but they'll sound minor when they're descending. Minor intervals will sound minor ascending. They'll often sound major when they're descending. So when you're doing the training in the app, whatever ear app you use, many of them have a setting where you can listen to them both ascending and descending. My recommendation is to start with ascending and learn all of them that way first, and then go into further training, learning descending intervals, And then finally, if you're using better ears, you can use a randomizer and it'll throw a mixture of ascending and descending at you. And that's helpful as well. That's all of the intervals right there for the chromatic scale. And again, doesn't matter what note you start with, what pitch you start with, these intervals will always be those names as you're moving.